tend to have two main questions about the elements of art. What are they, and why on earth should I care? Well, hopefully today I'll be able to answer both of those questions. And Nixie here will help me, won't she? Come here. Come here, pretty kitty. Well, let's start at the beginning. The elements of art, like the elements of anything else, are the basic components that we use to create the thing that they're elements of. So artists aren't always known for agreeing on everything and taking the rules and working within them. We tend to be a very diverse group, and we have very diverse needs for what we're working in, and so our lists tend to vary a little bit. Interior designer might have a slightly different list than an illustrator because they're doing completely different things. But most of the time you'll find the same 7 or variations on these same 7. They're line, shape, color, texture, value, form, and space. Even though some of these may feel very obvious and straightforward, like of course you use the lines to make art, being able to break down that concept and specifically analyze line work and understand how it works and how to use it different ways, that can help your art to be more intentional. It can help you to establish a better style overall, more cohesion, or it can help you to make pieces more distinctive and different and create specific effects in individual pieces. So having this list is actually really helpful to help you to make decisions carefully and intentionally about each one of these items. Value is perhaps the most misunderstood element of art because it actually has nothing to do with how many nickels and dimes you can get when you sell that picture, and everything to do with how light and dark parts of your picture are. So a very high-key painting would be very bright light. You'll see maybe white to medium gray with little to no dark areas, and a very low-key painting will be just the opposite, from that middle gray to black with very few highlights. These obviously change the mood of the picture completely. When you make something darker, it tends to be, well, darker. It's more depressing. It's maybe scary, or and if you took that same picture that was supposed to be, say, very haunting, and you made it light, it wouldn't have quite the same effect, most of the time. Value can also be used to simply make things more interesting. Most of the time, you don't want your picture to be very high-key or very low-key. Instead, you want it to have lights and darks and in the middle. And you want your value shapes to be interesting. You want to have interesting shapes to your dark areas and your light areas. You want to think about where you have your lights and your darks. And if you made this whole thing black and white, would it still look interesting? Lines are really fundamental to art. Obviously all the elements are, but I would say line even more so than the others. You can't have art without some kind of line. Even if you're painting a picture that is totally solidly one color, there's still lines around the edge of your canvas. There's still a border there. One of the most common distinctions to make is between organic and geometric lines, with geometric lines being either hard, rigid lines or carefully calculated curves, whereas organic lines are more organic. They're natural, curving lines, the sort of shapes that you would find in nature or that you would naturally draw if you're just doing things freehand. And of course there's a bit of a spectrum between those. For instance, if you're making straight geometric sorts of shapes but you're doing it freehand, they'll come out looking a little bit more organic than if you'd done it with a ruler. And those sorts of variations can actually be really important for making your piece look the way you want it to. Another important distinction with lines is drawn out lines versus implied lines. So for instance, this couch is a great example. Around the edges of the flowers, there's clear, distinct lines where the edges of these plants are, but there's not actually an outline there. You just know that's the edge of the flower. That does count as a line. It's a very nice organic line there. But then next to it, you've got these drawn lines where you've got the plants in the background, and there's even outlines on the leaves. And so both those kinds of lines are present, both those kinds of lines work, and they make the entire couch look more interesting because there's some variety in the two types. Another important distinction is hard lines versus soft lines. So a hard line is exactly what it sounds like. You've got a line, but a soft line is going to be a little bit fuzzier. It's going to feel a little bit more natural, maybe a little more out of focus. For instance, don't do this, it'd be creepy, but if you were to print out a picture of a screenshot of me right now, it would be really easy to take a Sharpie and draw exactly along these lines, except around my hair here. I've got, little flyaways, little bits of messed up stuff. It would be a little more complicated. It'd be much easier to communicate that edge around my hair by using lots and lots of little light pencil lines. And so those together would form what we call a soft line. In painting, this is really the most natural way to do lines. You paint your one color here and your one color there, and there's going to be a little bit of fuzziness in between them, but you can still make lines that are pretty hard and lines that are pretty soft. And it's important to choose those intentionally based on what you want to do with your picture. There is no right or wrong answer about what kinds of lines are best. It's just different styles, and it has a different effect. So if you want something to feel like a very bold, punchy cartoon, sure, the right choice there might be to, have actual outlines and to have them be very hard and probably kind of thicker and bolder, and maybe a lot more geometric than the things that you're drawing actually look in real life. But if you're wanting to do a really, really soft, romantic, beautiful, peaceful portrait, your choices should be totally different. You probably don't want to have outlines, and you probably want things to be much softer and more organic. And neither of those choices are wrong. In fact, both those choices can exist in a single piece, and they just make things more interesting. Colors are probably my favorite topic, and I mean that in the nerdiest way possible. So there's a lot that goes into what a color is. The main things that you talk about though with colors are the hue and the saturation. Then of course there's the value, but we've already talked about that as its own element, so we're not going to talk about that here. Hue refers to simply what color is it? Is it red, yellow, blue, green, orange, purple? If it's purple, how blue is it? How red? And so we're able to split those up into a nice little color wheel. And the other thing is the saturation. So if it's yellow, is it like a bright neon yellow, or is it kind of a dulled down brownish yellow? And the brighter and more that color that it is, the more saturated it is. So if it's less saturated, it's going to be closer to brown or gray, and if it's really saturated, it's going to be like paint fresh from the tube, something that just doesn't really even happen in real life. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to do color schemes based on colors that are similar to each other or that are opposites of each other. We call those complementary colors when things are the perfect opposite. So for instance, if I took the color blue, opposite of it on the color wheel is orange, and so those are complementary colors. They are perfect opposites. And if you don't have a color wheel or a good accurate color wheel sitting in front of you, a good way to remember it is that the opposite of a primary color, red, yellow, and blue, is going to be the combination of the other two primary colors. So the opposite of red is going to be a combination of blue and yellow, which is green. So green and red are complementary colors. These opposite colors make each other really pop and can be very fun, very high contrast and interesting. Whereas colors that are more similar, say blue and green, they don't have a whole lot of contrast between each other. They might be a little bit calmer and less poppy. There's also differences between warm colors and cool colors, so those are slightly subjective terms. I mean, everything's a slightly subjective term, but those are a little bit more subjective terms. But in general, when something is closer to blue, it's cooler. You can think of water. Those tend to be calming. They might be a little bit depressing. And if it's closer to orange, then it's warmer. So that's like fire, right? They tend to be more fun and energetic, but they can also be very overwhelming. They can be very punchy and in your face. And depending on what you want for this piece, either one might be exactly what you want. Usually, you want at least a little bit of both of them. So shapes are a natural extension of lines and can be categorized in all the same ways, with geometric and organic, with implied shapes versus like drawn out shapes. But one thing that is really important to be aware of when you're talking about shape as opposed to specifically lines is with your organic shapes, being aware of what geometric shape they're closest to. For instance, if you were to draw out a tree, then it might be able to be broken down into a rectangle and maybe a couple of circles or triangles or whatever. It can be really helpful to be aware of how many of different kinds of shapes you have in your composition. For instance, if everything that you're drawing can be really easily broken down into circles, except for one thing that's a rectangle, then that one thing that's a rectangle is probably going to stand out more than you might want it to. It's good to be aware of what basic shapes you've got in your composition, as well as where you're using rigid geometric shapes and where you're using more loose, rough, organic shapes. Much like shape is an extension of line, form is an extension from shape going into 3 dimensions, and so it can be categorized the same basic ways. For instance, this 3-dimensional form is composed of a jar that is largely geometric with all these concentric rings, and then the wax, which is melted just naturally and organically into this fun organic shape that I actually think is rather beautiful. And that combination, that balance, is actually pretty fantastic, might I just say. Form can actually be a little bit confusing sometimes because people use the term form to refer to the illusion of form, which is totally fine, but it's not what the actual element is about. The actual element will almost never come up in 2-dimensional images unless you're talking about like really thick painting that has like a very thick texture. Or I guess you could talk about form with a lot of my pictures because I'll like alter the canvases and stuff. Generally, form is 3-dimensional objects, and when you talk about the illusion of form, you're usually talking about something you've done with value to shade things so they look 3-dimensional. When we talk about the element of form, we're specifically talking about actual physical form, not the illusion. Texture is kind of an interesting element of art because it can refer to both physical texture, such as in a sculpture, and to the implied texture that we create using colors and lines and value. It used to seem kind of odd to me that we separated this out into its own element because we create texture and the illusion of texture using either form or color, line, value to create implied texture. Despite the fact that it's created with the other elements and thus probably shouldn't be considered an element in and of itself, it is really valuable to be able to analyze texture specifically, and that I think is why it ends up on most lists of elements. See, you don't want to create a picture where every single object looks like it's smooth or every single object looks like it's rough, unless you have a reason to create it that way. Generally speaking, you want to have a balance of different types of textures, especially if you're trying to create something that looks realistic. It's not realistic for everything in a scene to be the same texture. Everything is a slightly different texture, and it's important to be aware of that as you're rendering things out, whether that be with paint or chisel or your mouse, doesn't matter. As you're creating things, it's important to be aware of the textures that you're using for every part of your composition, and that you make sure you're not creating an effect that you don't want to create. Space, the final frontier. Sorry, I couldn't help it. Space refers to the way you actually have things positioned in your composition. So right now, I've made a choice with my space to have it roughly symmetrical and to have myself, the supposed focal point, be kind of small and in the center. Being in the center makes it easier for you to focus on me, maybe, but having it be so small maybe pulls your eye away to other places, which could make a piece more interesting, but doesn't keep you more focused on the person who's talking. So I'm gonna just hopefully that's still positioned right. Plot twist, that shot was absolutely terrible, so now we're here. In general, space can be broken up into two categories: positive space and negative space. Positive space refers to areas where something is going on, where you have an object or, a pattern, whatever, that people are supposed to be focusing on, and negative space is more like just the background. It's really simple in a situation like this, right here, this image, because obviously I am the focal point here, as I should be, and then behind me is a solid green background, and I don't think you can even make out much of the texture in the video. And the line between them can be a little bit fuzzy, especially if you're doing like, I don't know, a landscape or an outdoor scene and you've got like trees way in the distance or something. But generally speaking, you want to make sure that you've got a good balance with your positive and negative space, that you don't make things super overwhelming, that you don't make it incredibly boring with, one thing in the center and then totally blank around it. Of course, all of these effects can be used and can be used effectively, but as a general rule, you want to avoid those sorts of things unless you have a specific reason. You know that saying, know the rules well so you can break them effectively? That holds very true in art. You really want to be able to use all the principles that are related to space effectively, to be able to break up your positive and negative space in interesting ways and make a solid composition, if you will, that feels comfortable and natural and interesting, so that way you can create that when you want it, and you know how to use the wrong ways effectively. Say for instance earlier, having myself small centered near the bottom with all this interesting stuff around it didn't make any sense for this video. There wasn't a symbolic reason, there wasn't anything there except wanting to make this point. And now I have a composition that you could say is bad in another way, that I just have one thing and there isn't anything else of interest going on. I've got my focal point centered and just it's boring. But this kind of wrong is more effective for a video where it's just you listening to me talk than that kind of wrong was. So as I said throughout the video, there's no one right way to use any of these elements, but being able to understand and analyze a work based on each of these ideas individually can be really helpful to create an effect that you want. So instead of asking yourself, why does my picture feel so boring? Why is it not drawing the kind of attention that I want it to? Ask yourself, are my values interesting enough? Should I have more contrast in my colors? Does my line work fit the way that I want this piece to feel? Hopefully being able to analyze your work based on these sorts of questions can help you to create art that you can love and that will effectively express the things that you want it to express. So these are basically just tools that you can use any way you want, but you have to understand them if you're going to use them well. So as I said before, these lists of elements do vary, and I certainly didn't cover everything that I've ever seen on a list of elements of art. So if there's something that you're used to seeing on this list that I didn't cover, please let me know in the comments. There's a good chance that it's something that I just didn't even think of, and I'd be happy to cover in its own video. It also could be something that I consider to be more of a principle of design as opposed to an element. And I plan on making either another long video like this or mini short videos. But also let me know if there's any principles that you'd like me to cover, either because they're important to you or because you don't understand them. And I will get started on that as soon as I can. In the meantime, I hope that you'll use the elements of art in ways that make you happy and that express what you want them to express. And maybe just as an experiment, I would encourage you all to make a piece using one of these elements in a totally different way than you have in the past. See what happens, see if you like it. Okay, bye!